Welcome, everyone, to our Ovadia Heart Health live stream. I'm both honored and excited today to have Amber O'Hearn with us as our special guest. And I've got so many questions, and I'm sure you in the audience are going to have many questions. Please do put those in the chat so we can get to those as well. Before we launch right into our discussion with Amber today, we do have to let you know this is not personal medical advice in this live stream. This is for education and empowerment purposes. If you are interested in talking with someone directly at the Ovadia Heart Health team, please reach out to us at team@ifixhearts.com. So that's our housekeeping. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
I've been a longtime follower of your work, as I'm sure many are listening in, and those who are going to listen to the recording. That said, how about you give us a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with your work, kind of bring us up to date what you're working on now, and just give us a little brief background of how you ended up in this carnivore space.
Well, it's been a long, windy road, I think. I never really wanted to be a researcher in the nutrition space. Not that I wasn't interested in nutrition, but I had other ideas for myself. But because many nutritional paradigms have had such a tremendous impact on my life, I began to research it more deeply, starting with just low carb diets back in the late 90s, and eventually discovered the carnivore diet, which we weren't even calling the carnivore diet then, back in the late 2000s. And all that time, because the diets had such a tremendous impact on my own health, both physical and psychological or psychiatric, let's say, I was fascinated by it and begun doing my own research and just sharing with people what I was finding whenever there would be a question that would come up in the community. Especially back when I first started, the internet community around ketogenic diets, and especially carnivore diets, was much smaller and more individual, and there was a lot of discussion that was going on in places where people would just discuss what was happening to them, and ideas, just like now, would trend, and so people would have some kind of idea about how to do things properly, and sometimes they made sense to me and sometimes they didn't, and I would always go delving into the research to try to find out if there was support or not, or if there was already a disproof for something that somebody was claiming. And I started just slowly writing about this on a website, and eventually wanted to share that further and started speaking at conferences, and even have started publishing research papers in the field. So it kind of took over my life.
Yeah, and I think many of us would agree, and I use this term frequently about you, a meticulous researcher. And I see Kim Rittenhouse put a comment in the chat saying, Amber O'Hearn, what a metabolic genius. So yes.
Oh, that's very kind.
Yeah. There's many of us who would agree to that. And let me ask you this, and not to differentiate between the genders. However, I'm going to go down that path. As a female in this carnivore sector, it now has a name. Do you see any differences in the success, popularity, and maybe even in the efficacy among the genders?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I first joined the carnivore space, I would say that the split between men and women who are interested in participating was pretty much even. It was quite remarkable, actually. I think a lot of us came to carnivore through low carb and mostly for wanting to correct overweight and metabolic, more traditionally understood metabolic problems. And so for many people, especially women, I think tended at that time to be much more present in the weight loss space, even though I know weight problems happen on both sides. But I think that's why at that time there were a lot of women participating, and people were just finding that where they had run into a dead end with a low carb diet, even if it had helped somewhat, they might have stalled out above their preferred weight or regained without understanding why, even though they seem to be doing everything right. And so we're looking for ways to try to augment the low carb diet that they already had. And so that, I think, that's certainly how I found the plant-free version of the diet. And I think many people did come to it that way. Later, much later, like 10 years later, when the diet had exploded in popularity, at that point in time, people like Sean Baker really attracted a lot more people who were coming from the bodybuilding community, which tends to be skewed quite heavily toward men. And so at this point in time, I don't know for sure, of course, but it may well be that the carnivore diet is more popular with men than with women. I had a couple other thoughts about it, though. Even though a lot of us were drawn to the carnivore diet for the weight loss aspirations that we had, the reason that the carnivore diet really became such a popular thing is because what we found at that time was people would come for the fat loss and then find that some problem that they had that was plaguing them that they had no other way to deal with. Either it was considered incurable, or they're managing it with meds, or they thought it was genetic, or it just had something to do with aging, which no one can really do about. These things, and most especially autoimmune conditions, people were starting to see improvements on. So we would see regularly in our forum someone who said, I've been doing this diet for a few weeks and I just realized I haven't picked up my asthma inhaler, or my pain from arthritis is subsiding. And these were, now if people look into the carnivore diet, these are already like promises that people see. Oh, it's going to be good for this, it's going to be good for your mental health, and maybe rightly so, although a lot of the research has yet to be done to prove those out. But at that time, these were all just surprises. Like people would say, I know this sounds crazy, but. And the thing is that autoimmune diseases are skewed toward women. And although plenty of men also, it's not a only women, obviously, but I think it's higher occurrence in women to have autoimmune conditions. I'm suddenly doubting myself, so somebody check me on that. But insofar as that is true, you might find more women who get extra benefits from a carnivore diet that somebody else who doesn't have an autoimmune condition that they're dealing with will find that a low carb diet does them just as well, and they don't need whatever special extra magic that the reduction or complete elimination, I should say, of plants is providing. Another anecdote along the lines of men and women, your audience may or may not be familiar with the history of the carnivore diet. Almost all of our inspiration back in the early days came from two men, Vilhjalmur Stefansson, who was an Arctic explorer and who had written about eating only meat with the Inuit, and it had sort of on a bet, I think, maybe not a monetary bet, but he was often disbelieved, let's say, and so he agreed to go to a metabolic experiment with Karsten Andersen, another explorer, and go on an all-meat diet under supervision, and then have different metabolic parameters tested. They weren't in a ward the whole time. They were for a period of time, and then continued to be monitored from the home for a year. And interesting things were found, like, for example, that they didn't grow any deficiencies, except with the possible exception of calcium. There were no deficiencies shown. So Vilhjalmur Stefansson was a great hero. He had lots of writings. And then following him was Owsley Stanley, otherwise known as the Bear, who was the sound man for the Grateful Dead. He was also an athlete. He did ballet. And I believe that he found the meat-only way of eating also through reading Stephenson. But unlike Stephenson, who eventually sort of went back to his normal American ways, Owsley Stanley, the Bear, continued on his carnivore diet for the rest of his life. He died of a car accident, so hard to determine how he would have led out his natural life. But he had a lot of very interesting views, and one of them I can remember bantering around on the old fora, because he thought that it would be unlikely that women in particular would be able to succeed at a carnivore diet. And I'm not sure why he thought that exactly. In my experience, the very hardest thing about a carnivore diet is nothing like you might expect. You might expect I'll really miss all these foods. But the thing is, your palate adapts, and most people find that after some time eating only meat, they don't really want anything else. And all of those other fancy vegetables and fruits and sweets and all of those things just begin to look like not food. The way that, the flowers on the table don't look like food, and other people might enjoy them. But the real trouble, the real difficulty that people have with the carnivore diet is the social pressure. Like, you want to go to your family's house and they have a traditional thing that you've had all your life, or they want to give you a birthday cake, or they've made a meal just for you and it doesn't contain, you can't eat it because if you ate it, it's all mixed up with vegetables or something like that. And that kind of pressure and the desire to please people, I think, is even more enculturated for women than for men. And that might be a barrier that makes it a little harder to succeed for women. And I don't know if that's what he was thinking of, but that could be a legitimate difference.
And thank you very much for recalling for our listeners to those two great stories. Because often if something becomes a popular or a trend, as you called it, we think it just recently happened. The same, many people think ketogenic diet is something new, but it has quite also a historical past in the early 1900s as treatment for epilepsy. And even myself, when I got started early on, I started first just because it was a suggestion from a physical therapist after 2 years of all kinds of medical treatments, and no one could figure out, did I have an autoimmune disease? Did I have just early onset arthritis in my early 40s? But come lo and behold, 20 years of being a vegetarian, I was riddled with arthritis. I didn't have a weight problem, but I definitely had a physical moving problem. And then just experimented. And that's before just happened. My husband happened on to the work of Gary Taubes, and then we went down the rabbit hole there. And I think it's interesting also that you point out that these benefits in the early days, people were just noticing, hey, my eczema went away, or I don't need to use my inhaler. So let's go a little more into you mentioned a really great thing about the social pressure and that people have. What might be another sort of barrier to someone even wanting to just give this a go as an experiment?
Well, that's a good question. You have to be motivated because it feels so different. I think, like I said, your palate adjusts, your whole attitude kind of adjusts the way you look at your plate. But I think that when you're first presented with the idea of having nothing but meat on your plate, it just seems sort of overwhelming. The only way that I was able to tackle it was to tell myself it was just going to be a very limited in time experiment. When I first tried it, I was going to do it for 3 weeks, and I thought that's, I can do this for 3 weeks, but it still seemed really intimidating to me. And then there are, you could have doubts about, is this really healthy? Because there's just been so much pressure for so long, with propaganda telling us about the essentiality of fruits and vegetables, which it turns out really doesn't have any basis at all. Um, but that doesn't mean that you aren't going to have doubts if you've been hearing this all your life, and it's the sort of thing that everybody knows. And the other issue that goes right along with that is that you really have to be comfortable with eating a lot of fat. So a lot of people might start out on a carnivore diet, and this is exacerbated by certain variations or movements that are in the more current, the more modern carnivore diet that were not present at the time that we were doing this. And there are several of these things, but one of them, I think, is that a lot of people think that if you're trying to lose weight, you should eat leaner initially. And in my experience, and with the people that I, cut my teeth on with on the carnivore diet, that was we knew that that was unsustainable. Anyone who tried to do a lean version of the carnivore diet was ultimately and quickly rather going to fail, because you can't get enough energy that way. And even if you have a lot of fat on your body, some people who have a very robust metabolism, who aren't having a metabolic issue and are overweight for other reasons, manage to have a lot of fat on their body and have it come off easily, even when they're eating not very much fat. That happens, but it's not really the usual case. And if your body fat is not prepared to come off easily because maybe you have hyperinsulinemia, so the fat just isn't as willing to be released and burned, then what's going to happen is you're going to feel hungry. And if you just eat more protein to try to fill up hunger, it becomes a kind of vicious cycle. And this has been called rabbit starvation. It usually, in the historical context, rabbit starvation was meant to only apply to people who were so lean that they couldn't get fat to burn fast enough. Because basically, one of the limiting factors for how much fat you can burn at a time is how much mass there is. The more mass, the more will flow out into your bloodstream at a time. But the problem is it's not the only barrier. And so if you have hyperinsulinemia, if you have lipedema, which means that your fat is poorly structured and may not be releasable because the tissue has a problem, or if you have some other issue that's making it hard for you to burn fat as fast as you release it, for example, you will feel hungry even though there's still plenty of fat there. And so I forget why I've started on this rant.
The other challenges, it was
Oh yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
Right.
The challenge is,
Yeah.
if you grew up seeing that fat is bad for you, and you want to try a carnivore diet, and you think, well, I'm fat, I don't need to eat a lot of fat, the fat might be bad for me anyway, and you start off eating this very lean version, you might quite soon start to feel like, I'm just tired, I'm not sleeping well, I'm irritable. You might start to have problems with hormones and mood, irritation, and you'll say, this carnivore diet is not for me. As soon as I added carbs back, I felt a lot better. Well, yes, you felt a lot better because you gave yourself a source of energy.
Yeah. That's wonderful, because it really addresses the whole lack of a better term, fat phobia that we have. I mean, of that still is prevalent. Definitely. We say often within our team, eating fat doesn't make you fat, especially if it's the right kind of fat. Now, there's going to be nuances to that. But
Yeah.
this is a key point. And I just want to pause. If anyone wants to reach out to us about our employee wellness programs, that website is up here, ovediahearthealth.com/wellness, as well as Amber is such a wealth of information, and you need to check out her website if you already haven't at mostly-fat.com. And I want to also just take a few moments you've got a huge fan club, Amber, and that's something to be excited about.
I'm very grateful, actually.
Roxanne, she's awesome, helped change my life around 2019, 2020.
Thank
The
you, Roxanne.
Dog paw. I hope I'm pronouncing that. I went looking for a cardiologist that understood carnivore. So glad I connected with Dr. Ovadia and his staff almost 3 years ago. Thank you very much. We're excited to have you be part of our team. And right, so we'll keep going on that. But embracing that eating fat might actually be healthy for you. I'll just share one personal anecdote. I tried once for a little bit of time to eat only lean meat. And for the first time in decades, I couldn't believe how much I was obsessing about food. I was kind of hungry all the time. And I did it together with my husband, and we were like, this is crazy. Can't think about anything else except food. So that's, again, N is one, and a lot of that doesn't, but just from my own personal experience, lean meat was sort of a drama.
Yeah, you are not alone.
Yeah. But I want to talk about, we have this field that has really opened up, metabolic psychiatry, where people are using the ketogenic diet. Some people are using the carnivore diet for mental health issues. Do you want to speak to that just a little bit about any of your experience with that, or kind of how you've seen that develop?
Yeah, this is something that's really exciting to me personally, just because my issues, or my the thing that carnivore helped the most with for me was that I was initially diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and then later re-diagnosed with bipolar type 2, which is a kind of bipolar disorder where it's mostly characterized by depression. You don't have psychosis. And the only reason that you would really distinguish them is because I had something called hypomanias, which are sort of like manic episodes, but they just don't get all the way to a psychotic break. So you would have periods of excitement or pressured speech, maybe flighty ideas, wanting to stay up late, things that in a person with bipolar type 1 would be very dangerous. They would be the first signs of you're about to go into a manic episode. And so I had some of those. I actually believe that those were caused by the antidepressant medication that I was taking. I had been on Prozac for a really long time, and it was actually not doing anything for me. And when I moved and switched doctors, I got a new prescription. She said, "Why don't you try this other antidepressant, since this one's obviously not working for you?" And that's when those episodes started. So I actually think that that was the reason that those started. But you have to also have a susceptibility. So I wouldn't say that I'm not really bipolar or something. It's kind of hard to, there's a philosophical question there maybe, because I've been in remission for so long. Am I bipolar? Am I not? But regardless, for me, I was in such bad shape. Even before the bipolar diagnosis, the depression was just, making my life quite miserable. And to have stumbled upon something that quite unexpectedly made my mood stable and at a higher baseline was just absolutely a miracle for me. And so I knew already that when I was very compliant with my low carb diet, because I'd been on a low carb diet already for a dozen years, I knew that there was some correlation between my mood being better and having fewer carbohydrates. But I was still progressing. So for me personally, it wasn't until I went to a carnivore diet that resolved for me, really. But I know that some people are able to get remission or at least a lot of relief with a low carb diet, especially the more ketogenic it is. And I'm really fascinated by what I think might be two different but interacting components in the carnivore case, because typically, even though the carnivore diet has always been supposed to be a high fat diet, and I wouldn't say that what I was doing was particularly low fat, when you switch to a carnivore diet, you're suddenly probably replacing a lot of fiber with a lot more protein. Your protein levels are going to go up almost certainly when you move from a low carb diet that includes a lot of vegetables to one that doesn't. And so most people who are coming from a low carb or a ketogenic diet and go to a carnivore diet, unless they're very specifically motivated to keep ketones high, for example, they have a history of epilepsy or they know that their brain does better with high ketones, they'll probably go to a milder level of ketosis. So I was quite surprised to find that I had been, a big fan of ketosis and had learned all about how it was good for the brain. It enters the brain, gives, like, people call it an alternate fuel, and so it can make up for difficulties that people might have processing glucose, and it has all kinds of anti-inflammatory properties. It generates less oxidation in the brain, which is good. It has all these wonderful properties for the brain that we know about. So how was it that going on a carnivore diet from a low carb diet could actually give better results even though the ketones themselves were lower? And so at first I thought, well, maybe ketones aren't really as important for all this as I originally thought, and that there's somehow some kind of interference that's happening with plant components. And I still think that's true. I don't think we've settled on what the real mechanism is. I think that there are clues from, for example, intestinal permeability, and maybe also certain kinds of hypervitaminoses. But regardless, I now think that the combination of ketosis and plant-free diets can be uniquely beneficial for some people. And I've sort of, it's not that recent, but I've spun around from thinking that ketosis hardly matters at all to thinking the combination of these two things can be uniquely powerful. And if you manage to keep your fat up and just mitigate the protein a little bit, not necessarily going super low, but being mindful of how much the protein to fat ratios are affecting your ketosis, I think a lot of people really hit their sweet spot when they get to a highly ketogenic plant-free diet.
Wonderful. And there's so many tracking devices is there, and some people obsess about their trying to achieve a certain nutritional ketosis number. Others are more nuanced, but I think what's really important of what you're suggesting here is also you actually got better. When your maybe ketosis level was even just mildly.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something to really make sure that individuals understand is there might be, as you say, a sweet spot where you operate really well and a lot of your symptoms go into remission for a long time. And that's not per se a specific ketosis number.
Right.
I've seen a couple comments in here. Someone said you should add a link to the description. I'm not sure what that one is about. But please do. This is where you can reach Amber, mostly fat.com. You can also, we will interject here, we've got a bunch of white papers for free that you can download at the Ovadia Heart Health. Most recent one is on resiliency, and we talk about the nutritional benefits. Please take advantage of those. Those are all free. I want to go into what we hear from our team, our clients, our patients a lot is, okay, so what about fiber? And aren't you going to miss out on fiber if you do primarily a meat-based diet?
Well, it's definitely a very low fiber diet, yes. Fiber has been promoted for a really long time, and I think for all the wrong reasons, really. If you look through the literature that supports any kind of health benefit for fiber, what I have found is that those benefits seem to occur only when what you're actually looking at is the difference between a person eating more, I hate this word, but whole foods versions of plants that have their fiber intact versus people who are eating a much more highly processed plant product where the fiber has been removed. And so the difference, one difference between those is that one has more fiber and the other one doesn't. But there may be other differences in what's happening when you're doing all that processing that really have nothing to do with the presence or absence of fiber. And moreover, none of that really has anything to do with a diet that doesn't have any plants in it in the first place. And the fact is that we simply do not have a single study in which we have compared a completely all meat diet to an all meat diet with plants and vegetables. So there's no way to tease that apart. I consider fiber to be just a marker of the level of refinement of the carbohydrates in the diet. Other ways we can approach this question is to think about other mammals that we know of. So mammals are typically mostly carnivorous or mostly herbivorous, and with a very small number of animals that you might consider truly omnivorous. But there are plenty of carnivorous animals, like felines, for example. They're the sort of prototypical, let's say, canonical carnivorous mammal. And our gut functioning is not significantly different in humans and in cats. And cats don't have any need for fiber. And we should look to that and say, well, why would we think that we would need fiber if a cat doesn't? There have been also studies in dogs showing that if you feed them a diet that includes fiber or doesn't include fiber, the short chain fatty acids that you might look for that have been shown to have certain health benefits are equally there whether they're eating the fiber or not. And that's because the microbiome can still generate those short chain fatty acids even in the absence of fiber. And another concern that people sometimes have with the fiber question is whether they're going to be able to digest things properly. Some people worry about maybe constipation, and in practice that just very rarely happens. In fact, it's slightly more common to have looser stools when you start carnivore. I do want to make just a brief mention that in recent years, the idea that we need to have a lot of salt on the carnivore diet became prevalent. It's absolutely not true. Salt is very healthy, or very helpful, I should say, when you're starting a low carb diet of any kind, including carnivore, because you have these electrolyte adjustments and it can reduce certain unhappy symptoms that people might go through for the first few weeks. But after that, salt-free carnivore diets were basically the norm until quite recently. And when I first started seeing people advocating for salt, I thought, well, okay, it's not really what we're doing, and I don't think it's necessary, but what's the harm? Like, it's just a mineral. But I have learned in the past year or so that a lot of people have been finding that gut issues or digestion issues that they had when they started carnivore and that were ongoing went away when they stopped with the salt. So for that end of the spectrum, that could be a potential solution if some of you are suffering from that.
Interesting. And would you expand just a little bit on that? Meaning, are these individuals who are really overly additionally supplementing with salt, or just sort of normally salting their food very slowly, or are we talking the extra salt in some of the electrolyte mixes?
Both. I think it's more of a problem for people who are adding a lot of extra salt because they think they need to for, I think for basically for trying to solve the, keto flu symptoms, but that they think that they have to do that in an ongoing way. But I've also seen people who were not really adding extra salt. They weren't drinking salt. They weren't trying to get more than usual, but they were salting to taste, and they had a lot, like a large salt habit. I think that's also a palate thing. Who experimented with titrating that down to a very small amount or eliminating it completely, and finding that problems that they had had, such as sometimes ongoing cramps, ironically, muscle cramps might go away, that they used to have to try to correct with adding magnesium and potassium and trying to get all these levels right. If they took away the salt, then they didn't need to do that anymore. But also many people have mentioned that when they stopped salting their food, the digestion problems that they assumed were just how carnivore is, were able to resolve as well.
Interesting. It's fascinating. And also, we're also unique, right?
Yes.
The more you can experiment and do your own N is one. I know Nick Norwentz is the ultimate on that these days. But so are you, Amber. Another question that comes up frequently, and you alluded to, or not alluded, but shared the good story about Stephenson and his all meat diet. He didn't develop scurvy. What about the vitamin C? I know you've talked about this in certain talks you've given at conferences. Can you touch on that a little bit with a carnivore diet?
Yeah, vitamin C is a really interesting one because in almost every other case where, if you start from a premise that I don't even think is a good one, but if you're just saying, okay, we've got these RDAs, where a recommended dietary allowance for each of these nutrients that have in the past been identified as nutrients that we need to have to stay healthy or to avoid certain deficiencies. Most of these were developed to prevent frank deficiencies, and vitamin C is no exception. There is a deficiency disease associated with vitamin C, which is scurvy, and that's why it's called ascorbic acid, meaning meaning not or against, and scorbic meaning scurvy. But before we knew about the role of vitamin C, or let's say the ability of vitamin C to cure and prevent scurvy, we didn't really know what caused scurvy, and we knew that certain plant intake could prevent it or cure it, but we also knew that fresh meat could cure it. And fresh meat doesn't have very high amounts of vitamin C. It does have some vitamin C. And if you're eating a carnivore diet, the amount of meat that you're eating is so high because you're not eating anything else. There's nothing displacing meat. Arguably, there would be enough if you were eating a couple of pounds of meat a day and you weren't overcooking it to the point where there's heat loss of it, which I think would be somewhere around medium to get still get a good portion. That alone would be considered an antiscorbutic dose of vitamin C. But this is interesting to me, but it was still bothering me because what bothered me was that we had the observation that all these people were not getting scurvy. And so it wasn't like, I think some people approach this like, okay, I'm going to try a carnivore diet, but do I have to worry about vitamin C? And someone comes along and says, no, because there's an antiscorbutic dose. And that's like an argument, but it's really not the reason that we're not worried about vitamin C. The reason we're not worried about vitamin C is because in practice, people on the carnivore diet don't get scurvy. And so to me, it wasn't so much a question of, should I like tell people not to worry about getting scurvy? It was a question of, why aren't people getting scurvy? Because that's the kind of question that really makes me jump up out of bed in the morning. So besides the fact that I discovered that the nutrition database, at least the one that we use in the US, was incorrect about meat having no vitamin C in it, which is already kind of a revelation because, you know, if you're looking for where you're going to get your vitamins and the USDA database says there are none of that in what you're eating, then you're going to start looking elsewhere. But if you see that it actually does have some, then there's some bit of understanding. But I also started to wonder about, well, what are the functions of vitamin C? And vitamin C has multiple functions. One of them is that it's an antioxidant, a very powerful one. Most of the plant vitamin or antioxidant components that we get out of plants, they're called antioxidants, but they aren't actual antioxidants. What they are is they they are toxins that make your immune system produce your own antioxidants in response to it. It's kind of a hermetic response. But vitamin C is not like that. It is an actual antioxidant. But we have, especially when you're in a low carb situation, your uric acid levels may take over some of the antioxidant properties that vitamin C would otherwise provide. Like some birds, humans and other primates are pretty unusual in the fact that we don't make our own vitamin C. So other animals can make their own vitamin C, but they also degrade uric acid. And humans have developed this special combination where we keep uric acid and don't degrade it down, but we don't make our own vitamin C. And that combination is also seen in some birds. And I think that there is a bit of a trade-off in that ratio where some of the function of vitamin C is getting taken over there. The other things that are really important for vitamin C, though, are that they are coenzymes in the synthesis of both collagen and carnitine. And so I thought to myself, well, is it possible that the fresh meat, the reason fresh meat is able to help prevent scurvy is that it's providing some of those. And it turns out that although there's collagen in meat quite a bit, the way that we digest it breaks it down into the amino acids that have to be reconstructed, and it still requires vitamin C to get collagen back out of the ingredients from meat. So that was kind of a no-go. But with carnitine, it's actually, it is valid. So the carnitine that we eat, that we get from meat, can be used and can spare the requirement for the synthesis of carnitine. And carnitine is really particularly important when you're on a low carb diet because carnitine is needed for the shuttling of fat into mitochondria to be burned. And if you're low on carnitine, that could be a real problem if you're trying to get energy primarily from fat. And so carnitine is very important. It's important, you have to be able to burn fat, whether you're on a carnivore or low carb diet or not. But it turns out that with scurvy, one of the first symptoms that happens long before you start seeing the inability to make collagen for wound repair, for example, people get really, really tired. And it's believed that the carnitine synthesis is a big bottleneck that's causing scurvy. And so my speculation anyway is that one of the reasons that people on carnivore diets are not getting scurvy is that they're getting so much supplemental carnitine, and that in combination with the smaller amounts, but they're there, of vitamin C in meat, that is enough between the two of those to prevent that kind of problem.
Oh, fascinating, right? And we already had a couple comments. Oh, no needs for vitamin C decreases carnivores. I had no idea. That's from Robbie. And another comment up here from Phil. She is talking about me with salt, much better without. Cramps go away. 6-year carnivore. Fantastic, Phil. I love to hear those great results.
Very cool.
You mentioned the mitochondria. So I have to ask the question too. There's a lot of discussion about linoleic acid, and I can never pronounce it, as all of my pronunciation has this strange combination of Dutch accent and American.
That's wonderful.
But this difference between ruminant animals, for those listeners, are with multiple stomachs. They're, it's sort of fermentation process. But then you have your poultry and your pork. And some people say, maybe different associations with the content and the levels of linoleic acid. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, this is an interesting topic to me. A lot of people in the past few years have really come down on linoleic acid, and especially they say seed oil. So everybody has probably heard, whether you believe it or not, that getting fat from seed oils is unhealthy. But what people are really talking about is linoleic acid. And like you said, linoleic acid is present in most sources of fat, and definitely in animal sources of fat. With ruminant animals, the fatty acid profile that comes out based on a variety of different feeding stays quite stable because of the way that they convert different fats before they lay them down on their body. So you could feed a cow a higher linoleic acid diet, and it wouldn't really change very much how much linoleic acid there would be in the fat of your beef. Whereas on the other hand, with a monogastric animal like chicken or pork, they're very sensitive, like humans, to the fat that's on their body is going to be a much truer reflection of the kind of fat that they were being fed. And so the question is, how much of a problem is it to have high linoleic acid? In my opinion, there are different theories that people have when they are saying that linoleic acid is unhealthy. The one that I find the most compelling is one that has been most elaborated on by Peter Dobromilski. And what he has pointed out is that in the process of oxidizing, burning linoleic acid versus a more saturated fat, you end up not generating as much ROS, reactive oxygen species. And at first blush, that might sound good because we've all heard about oxidative stress and having too much reactive oxygen species in the body. But it turns out that reactive oxygen species are really, really important at the cellular level for sending signals. And what normally happens is, as you as you generate ATP, there's always some amount of ROS being generated too. And it's not that this is a leak or a mistake as it's sometimes portrayed. It's actually a signal telling your cell, it's like keeping a count sort of how much energy you've produced. And if your ROS levels get to a certain rate or amount, your body can extinguish those so they don't cause further damage, but they've gotten the signal and they tell the cell, basically tell the cell, you've had enough. And it's a signal of satiation and ultimately leading you to stop eating because you have gotten the signal that you're producing energy at a fast enough rate to maintain your body. When you are burning linoleic acid, the signal is not as strong. And so what the theory behind this is that if you're eating a mixed diet that contains linoleic acid and carbohydrate, you will not get a high enough ROS signal to make your cells start rejecting more glucose. And in fact, your fat cells will be more sensitive to insulin, which in this case is bad because they're sensitive to insulin, so they're taking the insulin signal to store more and more carbohydrate derived fuel as fat. So that theory is a theory of obesity that says that if your linoleic acid proportion of your diet is too high, carbohydrates will make you fat. And if it's low enough, then they won't. And so this would be, especially in a mixed diet, an argument for keeping your linoleic acid levels very low. However, if you're on a very low carb diet, it's controversial whether this would matter whatsoever, because since carbohydrates aren't making a significant proportion of your diet, that interaction won't happen. And you may end up burning more fat, letting more fat into your cells, but it's not having that interaction with carbohydrates that is causing your fat cells to become overfat.
Oh, great explanation there, and very, very clear on this differentiation, right? If you're on the low carbohydrate diet or if you're not, right? And again, how whether one uses the term fat adapted you are, but knowing where you kind of stand in that picture. Again, for those of individuals who want to reach out to Amber, her website, mostly-fat.com. I see someone is asking, where is Dr. Ovadia? Now, our medical practice is a virtual practice, so we're all across the nation. And I believe he is licensed in all 50 states, something incredible like that. So we're across the country. Also, I wanted to point out, and I know you're working on lots of papers, but if you haven't purchased the manual, the mammoth book, which is very hard to read late at night because it weighs so much. Amber has some brilliant research in the science of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction in human health, ketogenic, that was put out by the Nutrition Network. If you want to dive even more into the science. I know we're getting closer towards the end. I have to ask this, as I call myself a recovering vegetarian. I was 20 years down that rabbit hole. Why do you think plants get a free ride?
You mean, why are people so want to give them a halo or a pass as opposed to meat?
Correct. And that they feel obliged that a healthy diet, and if you're just listening and you're not watching, I did a little air quote, must include plants.
You know, my favorite idea about that comes from my friend Nick Mailer, who gave a talk back at the Ancestral Health Symposium in 2016, which is where I met him, called Chemophobia. And he described in some detail about the fact that people have for a long time considered plants to be sort of a like an ethical kind of food. It's to be contrasted with meat which is carnal and bloody and violent seeming. And he made a much better case than I am in this moment to say that that there's this almost religious sort of feeling about associating meat with carnal pleasure and with evil, and vegetables with sort of reining yourself in and being good and pure. And I think there's a lot to that, actually.
I love that explanation. I'm a fan also of Belinda Fetke, who I'm sure you're familiar with,
Yes.
who's done a lot of research in the Seventh Day Adventists and Ellen G. White and that particular, let's say, analyzation of this carnal feeling associated with meat and the purity associated with plants. We do have a focus here on these Monday live streams in terms of trying to help companies, individuals and companies. And you can, if you want to know more about our employee wellness programs, the link is right up there, /wellness. Helping bridge some of the knowledge gaps, helping employers understand that a meat diet might just be a really healthy one. What could be one or two small steps, either for the individual in a workplace or someone who's leading a company, that they could start to implement?
I thought about this question, and it's really difficult because even though carnivore has gained a lot of attention, such that I don't know if it's accurate that most people have heard of it. I feel like most people have heard of this, but I don't think it's at the point where most people think it's a good idea, and that includes in the health space. And so if you are in the position of wanting to have people guide your employees in one of these emerging, let's say, therapeutic diets that have had there's less experience with them. The main thing that I would want to see if someone was going to try to give information to their employees or to help them if they're interested in a ketogenic, but especially on a meat-based diet, that that you would find someone who really has experience with it and has some expertise and can talk to the people who are in the program and help just sort through all of these very natural questions that come up when things go against what you've been taught.
And we did not tee Amber up for that, but I will say, if you want an approach that is beyond disease management with your programs, please reach out to us. We'd love to even just have a conversation with it. Is there something, Amber, that I didn't ask you that you were wanting to, comment on or share with us, because you have such a wealth of experience?
That's a great question, but I feel like we covered a lot of good things. I've been doing a lot of different sort of side analyses, and I was really excited to be able to do some papers on sleep in the last couple of years. And so we don't really have time to launch into the relationship between ketogenic diets and sleep, but I wanted to let you and your audience know that I did have some thoughts on that and have written on it that might be helpful, especially if someone has noticed that when they're on a ketogenic diet, their sleep is not where it was, and some ideas for that. The very, like, the one sentence summary is that it comes back to the getting enough energy and getting enough fat. Energy is a requirement for sleep, for good sleep, it turns out. And so if you're not eating enough, that could be one way that that's showing up.
Oh, wonderful there. And can that paper be found on your website, or is it not out yet?
Yeah, I have two. I have links on my website, and you might also find it if you search PubMed for Amber O'Hearn and sleep.
Well, this was truly like a deep honor. I really appreciate all the research you have done, and you've been doing this a long time. And there are many of us who are part of your fan club, as you saw in the comments here today. And where might individuals, are you going to be at any upcoming conferences that people can be looking for you, or should they just stay tuned to your website?
Yeah, unfortunately not. I don't have any travel in the works where I could meet people. I need to figure that out.
Yes.
But yes, I will next time I know that that's going to happen. I tend to make these announcements on X. If X is not your thing, there's a free subscription on Mostly Fat that will get you an email anytime I release a post or have some news.
Lovely. Right. Once again, we'll put Amber's website up there, mostlyfat.com. If you want to find out about our metabolic health focus programs, reach out to us, ovediahearthealth.com/wellness. And thank you so much for joining us today. And keep doing what you're doing. And we're all going to be watching out.
Thank you, Krisna. The pleasure was mine.
All right. Thank you, Amber.